As the 1960s were turning into the 1970s, John Wayne was not only the top box office attraction of the last 30 years, but he was also something close to a living national institution, a personification of all the qualities and attributes that Americans like about their country and themselves. It's sort of status that not many others have ever approached, and which, in all likelihood, nobody ever will again. In fact, the only other names I would put on that list, on that Mount Rushmore of people who were national institutions in their own lifetimes, it's a short one. What? Babe Ruth, Elvis Presley, maybe Johnny Cash, and that's about it. But as he approached senior citizenship and the final half dozen years or so of his acting career, there was one thing John Wayne didn't have that he really wanted: a freaking Oscar. As we know, John Wayne isn't the type of actor who normally wins a lot of acting awards. Normally, acting awards go to character actors and not so much to movie stars, people like John Wayne, who effectively play versions of themselves in every picture. But in 1968, John Wayne read a novel that he thought could help him solve this Oscar problem. The book was called True Grit. The author was Charles Portis. And in the character of U.S. Marshal Reuben J. Cogburn, John Wayne saw himself and potentially the role that could land him that coveted golden statuette if everything went just right. So Wayne starts working the telephones, and he makes sure everybody in town knows that he really loves this book, and he wants to star in the film adaptation because he thinks he can win himself an Oscar with it. And so, unsurprisingly, every screenwriter in Los Angeles County begins feverishly scribbling the night away trying to get the first screenplay out. The winner, in something of a surprise, was Marguerite Roberts, who had been, back once upon a time, one of the most sought-after screenwriters in the game back in the golden age in the 1930s, but she wound up losing everything she had in 1951 when she and her husband, John Sanford, both refused to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee and were thus blackballed from the industry as a result. She spends 11 years in professional purgatory, only getting rehired by Columbia Pictures in 1962, and she only has 3 minor scripts produced between 62 and 68. And while you wouldn't expect John Wayne to be teaming up with a former suspected communist, he loved the script so much that he went to bat for Marguerite Roberts. He said, "This script is the one, and she's the one that wrote it, and that's all there is to it, so let's go make it." And though the script had been specifically written as a vehicle for John Wayne to win himself an Oscar with, there was still a very particular process that had to be followed after John Wayne decided that he was going to make a picture. You see, John Wayne was such a big star and such a living institution that he had his own team of in-house screenwriters. So when he agreed to play a role, part of the deal was that the script then gets turned over to his people so they can go through and rewrite all of his characters' dialogue so as to make it fittingly John Waynian. So getting John Wayne to agree to be in your film is just the first step in the process. The next step is making the thing into a John Wayne picture, which is why you keep a whole team of professional personal screenwriters on permanent retainer, right? Wayne did wind up winning his Oscar that year, of course, the only one that he would ever win, and it must have given him no end of satisfaction that one of the other nominees he beat out was George C. Scott for his portrayal of General George S. Patton, which even then was already seen, and correctly so, as one of the greatest on-screen performances in history. So was the 1970 Oscar for Best Actor more of a Lifetime Achievement Award for John Wayne than anything else? Yeah, it probably was, and there is nothing wrong with that. Now here, let's watch a bit of it.
I'm not going to tell you. The winner is John Wayne in True Grit.
If I'd have known that, I'd have put that patch on 35 years earlier. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm no stranger to this podium. I've come up here and picked up these beautiful golden men before, but always for friends. One night I picked up two, one for Admiral John Ford, one for our beloved Gary Cooper. I was very clever and witty that night, the envy of even Bob Hope. But tonight I don't feel very clever, very witty. I feel very grateful, very humble. And oh, thanks to many, many people. I want to thank the members of the Academy. To all you people who are watching on television, thank you for taking such a warm interest in our glorious industry. Good night.
Jim Eagle, fill your hand, you son of a bitch! From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where we serve true grits each morning for breakfast and only use true grit in our sandpaper. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I am your eponymous host and humble servant. And in the current epoch of filmmaking, the woke Hollywood era, if you will, we do get lots of remakes, but they are always the wrong kind. Naked, brazen, insufferable cash grabs that evince nothing but the creative bankruptcy of the screenwriting industry and the desire to bludgeon the audience about the head and upper torso with woke bullshit politics for 2 or 2.5 hours or so. But remakes are not always a bad thing or a bad idea. Today they are, that's for damn sure, but that has more to do with today's ridiculous speech codes and diversity quotas than anything else. But as one peruses the entire history of the cinematic arts, one sees that some of the very greatest films ever produced have been remakes or reimaginings or readaptations of earlier works. In fact, nearly all of the great historical epics of the 50s and 60s were based in large part on earlier works that had been done in the silent film era. No, remakes aren't automatically bad or non-worthwhile just because they are remakes. But they often are very bad and very non-worthwhile, especially these last 10 years or so, since the new Bolshevism took hold and crushed everything in its path like a King Kong Godzilla hybrid monster of awfulness. If you remade True Grit today, we all know exactly what that would look like. The Maddie Ross character, the precociously intelligent, self-assured 14-year-old girl, she would be transformed into a full-on 21st century woke girl boss character who spends the entire film saving the male characters from their own stupidity and ineptitude when she is not defeating them in hand-to-hand combat. So it was quite a happy accident that the Coen brothers did their remake of True Grit in 2010, because if they had waited 5 more minutes, the thing probably never gets made. Because it just ain't woke enough. And there's another thing that one often notices about movie remakes here in the woke Hollywood era. They are seemingly never done by filmmakers who have any regard for the original film or the people who love the original film. Far more often, remakes today seem to almost always come from a place of scorn and hostility. As if the director and the screenwriter are saying, yeah, you like that old movie, do you? Well, that movie you like, it's really a huge piece of shit. It contains outdated attitudes, and it doesn't have nearly enough diversity and inclusion. In fact, liking that movie means you're probably a racist. So we're going to give you a very new, very woke, very enlightened version of that old movie that you love so well, so that when you watch the new version, you can think about what a racist piece of shit you were for liking the old one. Because movies are not about providing you, the audience, with an enjoyable 2-hour diversion from reality. No. Movies are about making you realize what a terrible person you are. Movies are about making you feel guilty for being so much less enlightened than the filmmakers. Movies are about the shame that you should rightly feel for all those years you spent selfishly enjoying non-diverse films with problematic messages. But remakes can be great. They can be, when they're done right, as good as motion pictures can get. And for the roadmap of how that's done, look no further than the 2010 version of True Grit. But you know what the most crucial factor in bringing a good and worthwhile remake to fruition is? The people making the new version have to actually like the previous version and not hate it. I watched both versions of True Grit consecutively this past weekend. I've seen both before in isolation. The original not for many years, the newer one probably only once or twice right around the time it first came out. But when you watch them back to back, it could not be clearer that the people making the newer movie, they know and they love the older movie. And they know and they love the original Charles Portis source novel. There is no desire to fix what is wrong with the earlier production, because there is nothing wrong with the earlier production that needs to be fixed. If anything, where the 1969 picture originated as a vehicle for John Wayne to win himself an Oscar, the 2010 picture is a more direct and faithful adaptation of the original work. In Jeff Bridges' portrayal of Rooster Cogburn, there is not the slightest trace of John Wayne's Rooster Cogburn. But it's not correct, and not by a long shot, to say the 2010 version utterly ignores the 1969 version, because that would be a stupid thing to suggest. And this is another thing that woke Hollywood filmmakers always get wrong when they do remakes. They far too often lose sight of the fact that when you remake an existing picture, the people who are going to be most interested in seeing it are the fans of the earlier film. And if you take the approach of changing everything around to be in better alignment with today's fashionable woke political views, you are just going to piss those people off. And I need to say a word here briefly about Haley Steinfeld. Do you remember that god-awful Hawkeye show last year, whenever it was? I think it was the last Marvel show I actually attempted to watch, incidentally. Don't think I ever made it to the end, but probably doesn't matter. Haley Steinfeld, of course, plays the new perfect, invincible girl boss female version of Hawkeye in that series, whose job is being better at everything than the original male Hawkeye. And as I am watching this ridiculous, insufferable cringe fest, I can't figure out where I have seen Haley Steinfeld before. I know I have seen her in something somewhere, but I can't remember what the hell it was. Until I rewatched the 2010 version of True Grit. Yep, that was it. She was Maddie Ross, and what a shame, what an incredible shame when a young actress is capable of such a powerful performance as that. And 10 years later, the industry has nothing better for her to do than Girl Boss Superhero Bullshit Volume 67? And she gets bonus points for having been an actual 14-year-old playing the role of the 14-year-old character, as opposed to Kim Darby, who was 21 years old playing 14 in the original. And the second film, much more in keeping with the source novel, is seen from Maddie Ross's perspective, whereas the first film, having been fashioned as a vehicle for John Wayne, is told mostly from the perspective of his character, with Maddie Ross being more of an ancillary supporting player. A viewer who has never seen the 1969 film can enjoy the 2010 version just fine, but like I mentioned before, if you are the filmmakers, you have to be mindful of the fact that a majority of your viewers are going to be people who know and love the earlier film. And they want to see things and hear things that they recognize. They want to pick some member berries, just a few, in other words. And there's nothing wrong with a bit of nostalgia bait, as long as it's done tastefully and in moderation. And that's what the Coen brothers give us in their version of True Grit. The most iconic camera shots, the most famous bit of dialogue, are copied directly. In fact, everything in the first movie that is directly a quote from the book is also directly quoted in the second movie, and that's the best approach to take. You're left with two great motion pictures of the same story made 4 decades apart, each one of which can stand alone just fine on its own merits, but which also serve as complements to one another. I can watch both of these films back to back, and aside from the brief little bits that are directly copied, I don't even feel like I have watched 2 different adaptations of the same source material. I feel like I have watched 2 great and worthwhile films that are each great and worthwhile in their own way. But great and worthwhile, it doesn't mean problem-free. In the 1969 version of True Grit, it does have a couple of problems. Most of it has to do with the number 2 male lead. You see, when John Wayne first read the True Grit novel and got to work envisaging this thing as his own personal Oscar vehicle, he got it into his head very early on that he wanted a famous singer to play the role of LaBeef, the Texas Ranger. His first choice, Elvis Presley. And Elvis was actually pretty keen on doing the picture. At least he was at first. Even though he was right at the tail end of his movie star period at that point, he had been desperate to play something that required an actual acting performance instead of the years-long succession of god-awful paint-by-numbers Elvis movies that he had been doing for most of the 1960s. You know, hey, Elvis is a singing boxer in this one, and Elvis is a singing race car driver in this one, and hey, Elvis is a singing surfer in this one. And, you know, but as a practical matter, Elvis wasn't all that much different, really, from John Wayne in that respect. He wasn't an actor who played various characters. Rather, he was a star who played slightly different fictionalized versions of himself from movie to movie. But Colonel Tom Parker was not having any of this. So as was his habit, he came up with a creative way of making sure Elvis didn't do the thing that Colonel Tom Parker didn't want him to do. He simply called up John Wayne's people and said, well, sure, my boy Elvis will be happy to do your picture, as long as he gets top billing over John Wayne and makes double the salary. And he never told Elvis about that, naturally. Doggone it, Colonel, I really wanted to do that John Wayne picture. Whatever happened with that? How come that deal fell through? I don't know, son. They started making all these exorbitant demands. I had to say no. You know how it is. I'm just looking out for your best interests. So the Elvis thing falls through, but John Wayne, for reasons that are anybody's guess, he still wants a famous singer playing the role of LaBeef. So he goes to a Glenn Campbell concert one night. He goes up to Glenn Campbell backstage afterward and he says, son, how'd you like to co-star in the next John Wayne picture? And Glenn Campbell says, well, gosh, sir, that really does sound great. It's just that I have never acted before. And it shows. In fact, the biggest problem with the original True Grit is the fact that Glenn Campbell has never acted before. That's not to say he does badly. He does about as well as you could expect a total neophyte actor to have done, but when you put him in the same scene with John Wayne and Robert Duvall, it's not difficult to see who the professionals are and are not. In the 2010 version, you've got Matt Damon in that spot, and the picture prospers for it. It prospers more for the fact that Damon plays the role 100% straight with no scenery chewing whatsoever, even though he could have been forgiven for playing it differently, especially with the Coen brothers in the driver's seat, since the Coen brothers are at their best when their pictures are just barely skirting the boundary between seriousness and absurdity. The original movie succeeds at both of the things it tries to be. Number one, a John Wayne picture, and number two, a Western movie from the 1960s. As for the second film, we sort of have to call it a Western because of the time and place and the subject matter, but above all other descriptors, it is wonderfully and gloriously a Coen Brothers movie, with all the strange dialogue and awkward silences and bleak, lonely, isolated landscapes that entails. If those guys were ever going to do a Western, this was exactly the right Western for them to do. And it's also a remake that does everything right that a remake can do. It stands on its own merit, but it's also a tribute and a love letter to what came before. It provides a different interpretation of the source text while delivering enough little shout-outs to keep fans of the original film happy and satisfied. And it doesn't look down its nose at anybody, which is why it's a picture that could never get greenlit in the year 2023. In the year 2023, the only remakes are woke remakes. In the year 2023, you can't remake a 40-year-old film unless it is full of race swaps and gender swaps and unmistakable signals that if you are a person who likes the original version of this thing, then the makers of the new version hate you because you're a terrible person. Because only terrible people enjoy old movies that the rainbow Bolsheviks have declared problematic. It would be nice to once again live in a world like 13 years ago, where you could do a respectful remake of a much-loved film without insulting and sneering at the first film's audience. A remake that doesn't seek to shoehorn a story from an earlier time into the strictures of today's idiotic woke speech codes and thought crime prohibitions. A remake that seeks nothing but to do right by the original, to do well the same things that it did well, to be a work of cinematic art that does justice to the literary works of the past rather than mangling them beyond all recognition. I just wish the woke Hollywood era would hurry up and be over so we can get back to that world and good filmmakers can start making good films again. Thanks very much indeed for watching. I will see you next time. Have a pleasant tomorrow. Do not comply. Get off my lawn.